My name's Matt O'Hara, and I'm the chair of the history department. And I'm really pleased to welcome you all here for this super happy event that we hold every May. And it's a special time because it's not that often that we actually get the history department together as a community. And that means the faculty that I work with. It means our students that we're very proud of the work that they've done this year, obviously. It means other friends and family. And the students who are presenting today, and really all of those who've done big research projects this year, have become a part of the history community really in a different way by taking on a major project and really taking ownership of their education. And you can see that already in the paper titles if you've been browsing through the program, and you're certainly going to hear that today in the fantastic work that they've done and the mentorship that they've received from the faculty that they've worked with. So I know you're here to hear them and not me, so now I'm going to turn it over to Kate Jones, Professor Kate Jones, who is our undergrad director, who will introduce the rest of the program.
Thank you, Matt. And so we won't delay too long getting to the heart of the matter, which is getting to hear these great papers. So I'll just note, so I'm Kate Jones. I'm a member of the faculty in the history department, and working with the Undergraduate Education Committee, I have the good fortune to get to review a whole bunch of exit seminar papers, the research projects and theses that our students develop as part of the kind of culminating assignment of their major. And out of that big pool of papers, we select a few to present at this showcase. So I just want to underscore that the work that the students who have done today and that they're presenting today reflects really outstanding scholarship and research on the part of our undergraduates. And it's really a pleasure to get to not only review all those papers, but get to have them share their research here with you all today. So that's the main kind of objective here, is to get glimpses of these larger projects. And I'll just note that many of the people who are presenting are having to distill down really extraordinarily deep projects into very short presentations, and they've done a wonderful job of doing that. But to say there's a lot more behind these projects. And I'll just note, we're kind of, if you've been to one of these before, we have a slightly different format in that we're going to introduce that we're going to have two panels of 3 papers each, but we're going to forego the formal question and answer portion, and instead we'll be able to circulate and ask questions to people individually while you get a drink and things in between the sessions. So we're skipping that part just in part to keep things moving along, because we know a lot of people have competing demands on their time. So that's the way we're moving forward. So I'll just go ahead and introduce the first panel and the first panelists, and that is Jessica Chuidian-Ingersoll, who's kindly coached me, who's presenting about her thesis research that was entitled "Right to a Roof: The Fight for Rent Control and Tenant Protections in California, 1978 to 1995. And in preparing that thesis research, she worked with David Brundage in our department and Mary Beth Puddup in community studies. And so I'll just also note that Jessica is the recipient of a history department Linda Peterson Award in local history for her paper. And so I'd like to invite Jessica up to share her research with us.
Hi. My name is Jessica. My thesis on A Right to a Roof was inspired by a chant from tenants groups in the Bay Area. I first heard it in Spanish at a tenants' rights rally, Derecho a Techo, and later studied under a larger theme of housing as a human right. My thesis is a story of California renters and their struggle for housing in the middle of one of the country's most extreme housing shortages. One of the biggest challenges for me while researching this was knowing that the story still has no ending, and I'm unsure if we really have even reached the climax of California's tenants' rights movement. I focused on rent control as a central theme, not only because it was the main rallying cry for tenants during this time, but because of its controversy and how it challenges the ideological core of the United States. I discuss how rent control brought to light class tensions that pervade our housing systems, as well as many progressive circles. I'll read an excerpt from my thesis that I think demonstrates this controversy the most. In the United States, property rights are quintessential elements of personhood, defining citizenship, freedom, and economic liberty. However, rent control in its purest form is a direct public intervention into private markets. So while the US has instituted rent controls on several occasions, like the Great Depression and the two World Wars, support for that was based on this widespread recognition that those were emergencies. But how did this definition of emergency apply to a peacetime economy, but with severe housing shortages that forced thousands of tenants from their homes? Tenants' main challenge then was to reframe how governments defined emergencies and their accountability to the public during them. Emergencies, they argued, were not only battles of soldiers and weapons, but of shortages, poverty, and insecurity. And there was and still is no easy way to challenge this narrative. For what is actually all of US history, low-income communities and communities of color have always known insecurity. Legalized segregation through redlining and racial covenants effectively barred all non-white tenants from homeownership for decades, despite fair housing laws that came out of the civil rights movement. These ramifications set many communities up for the bulldozer in the 60s, when urban renewal programs destroyed thousands upon thousands of units and did not rebuild enough affordable housing to make up the difference. What went up instead were financial buildings, investments in commercial enterprises and parking lots, tax-generating entities that brought in white-collar workers with higher incomes to rent for 2 times what they used to be. And this happens all over California. One tenant couldn't just leave San Francisco and move into Oakland, at least not for long. Tenants were being pushed to the wall, but they were not the only actors in this story. In my thesis, I want to emphasize how non-landlord homeowners also played a role in building the California tenant movement. I pinpointed Proposition 13 as the catalyst of this movement, which was a tax cut measure which addressed the pressure of inflating property taxes. And property taxes were causing a lot of hardship for homeowners who were trying to pay their homes off and survive during the inflationary era. Otherwise known as the Taxpayers' Revolt, this movement was about cutting taxes in half and making new taxes harder to pass, but significantly. With over $2 million going into it, in its day it was the most heavily financed campaign initiatives in California history. And it passed. The important part of this story, though, is that this bill would not have succeeded without renters' votes. There are numerous records of landlords encouraging renters to vote for Prop 13 with the promise that if they had lower taxes, renters would have lower rents, trickle-down economics. But Prop 13, when analyzed from a historical perspective, actually harmed renters more than it helped them. Communities lost many of the institutions which eased the burden of a tight income: quality public education, open access to books and computers with libraries, and neighborhood medical clinics. And rent increases didn't stop at all. 17 days after Prop 13 went into effect, a hotline in San Francisco recorded 987 complaints about rent hikes. Tenants unions then seized upon this sense of injustice, and they demanded that renters deserve the same relief and dignity as property owners. Cities with unions grew stronger, those without organized their own. I focus on 2 cities, Santa Cruz and San Francisco. It was difficult to find a lot of secondary research on them, so I had to rely on a lot of primary sources: homemade documentaries, campaign literature, letters to the editor, letters to the state legislature, and think pieces from both sides of the rent control campaigns. From this research, I explored the diverse nature of tenants unions, from political ideology to racial, gender, and age composition, to their tactics. While there was a lot of content about groups in LA and San Francisco, there's a smaller record of groups that popped up in cities like Hayward, Thousand Oaks, and Palm Springs. Many of them don't exist today, and their rent control ordinances are very weak. But the few articles that tell their story show us how widespread of an issue this was for all types of communities: progressive, conservative, urban, or rural. But for the most part, I chronicle how most unions built their base on this renter identity, and some even extended their issues to other things such as labor or racial or gender justice, especially since they were mainly neighborhood and community organizations that were often composed of a majority of Latino or Filipino, African-American tenants, or people that worked primarily in a certain industry, like longshoremen in San Francisco. Beyond just rent control, though, organizing around the evictions of neighbors and building neglect by landlords was a common rallying cry that drew attention to renters' issues and brought about citywide responses such as the right to form tenant associations and withhold rent. So not only was rent control a popular policy among grassroots tenant organizations, but many groups also had other goals as part of their vision: anti-speculation, demolition control, and eviction protections. They all made appearances in California during this time. So I also argue that this movement by tenants had woken a sleeping giant in the state's apartment and realtor associations. So my thesis also explores the extent to which statewide property owners associations invested themselves into fighting rent control at the local level. Since the 1970s and a little bit earlier, real estate interests at the state level spent millions upon millions at the local level, allowing for local saturation of anti-rent control advertisements, as well as public research tools that allowed them to survey public opinion and key in on certain anxieties about socialism and government control. Real estate PACs sponsored and passed new legislation to preempt rent control locally, exempt millions of units from ever having local rent control. So although this is still debated today, money did have a lot to do with it. The inequality in campaign expenditures is still being researched today, with some scholars naming this the initiative industrial complex. So from another perspective, this is also a story of how an industry has over time consolidated its power at the state level to intentionally weaken tenant organizing at the local level. One of my more personal takeaways, though, was just how severely rent control cut through progressive circles. Many activists who once worked together on issues like accessible healthcare or environmental conservation found themselves intensely opposed to each other. For one, I connect these tensions to the underlying ideological challenge rent control posed to people's private property rights. In places like Santa Cruz, there were and still are a lot of small landlords who didn't see themselves as part of this pattern of displacement. Many of them identify as liberals and supporters of affordable housing, but being a landlord was a matter of basic security. Rent control would only make the housing crisis worse because they would sell their properties if they couldn't make a profit. And this argument was found everywhere in anti-rent control campaigns. But how did this argument come up against a national housing crisis, an affordable housing shortage? To what extent were cities willing to protect private property at the expense of public health and tenants' homes? So what I wanted people to take away from my thesis was a way to understand an issue as controversial as rent control, especially because the housing crisis has reached unprecedented levels today. If you remember anything about local elections last year, I'm sure it was the Measure M campaign for rent control in Santa Cruz. I don't want readers to come away supporting rent control as a successful or an unsuccessful policy. Rather, my intention was to point out what's happening now with an open mind about how we got here, how history has shaped the current affordable housing crisis, and know the difference between who has been invited to the table and who has had to fight to be there.
All right, thank you very much, Jessica. So our next presenter is Michele Cole. She'll be presenting based on her research paper entitled I Remain an Irishman and a Jew, Conflicting Identities of Ireland's Jewish Politicians, which she developed working with Bruce Thompson in the history department.
Hi everyone, my paper is called I Remain an Irishman and a Jew, Conflicting Identities of Ireland's Jewish Politicians. The idea of an Irish Jew may seem like a novel concept. This is in part because Catholic-Protestant conflicts in Ireland dominate perception of Irish religious divides, and partly because the Jewish community in Ireland has always been a tiny minority, numbering just over 5,000 people at its peak in 1936 to 37. However, Jews have had a significant presence in Irish cultural and political life. To explore this, my paper focused on 3 Irish Jewish politicians, Robert Briscoe, Chaim Herzog, and Alan Shatter. My paper traced how each man dealt with questions of identity and Irish anti-Semitism, and the degree to which they emphasized or downplayed both concepts. While each man has a distinctly different relationship with their faith and with their identity as an Irishman, all 3 reveal in their biographies the struggle of reconciling these 2 identities. The first autobiography I focused on was Robert Briscoe's For the Life of Me, published in 1958. His biography was also my most illuminating source. Briscoe was the Lord Mayor of Dublin 1956 to 1957, and again 1961 to 1962. His book is a key text in showing how some Jews in Ireland navigated being a minority by hyper-emphasizing their Irish patriotism. His political career took place in the shadow of the Holocaust, and Briscoe was forever having to prove his loyalty to Ireland, even though he had an extensive patriotic history, which included being a gun runner for the IRA during the Irish War for Independence. His book is peppered with statements such as, "I sometimes wondered if I loved Ireland more than I did my God," yet such extreme declarations never fully satisfied his critics. The second autobiography I focused on was Chaim Herzog's Living History, published in 1996 towards the end of his life. Herzog was born in 1918, and his father was the chief rabbi of Dublin and an extremely prominent member of the Irish Jewish community. Herzog left Ireland for Palestine as a boy in 1934, where he later became president of Israel from 1983 to 1993. Herzog is interesting to compare to Briscoe because Herzog's Jewish identity took full precedence over his Irish identity, as his political career took place outside of Ireland. Herzog was not constrained by accusations of dual loyalty, as he could fully embrace his Jewish identity. However, Herzog still had pride in his Irish roots, even going so far as to have the Irish singer John McCormick play to announce his arrival at state functions. My third and most contemporary source was Alan Shatter's biography, Life is a Funny Business, published in 2017. Shatter is a former member of Parliament, former Minister for Justice and Equality, and former Minister for Defense. He is also interesting to compare to Briscoe due to their contrasting time periods in which they were politically active. More than half a century after Briscoe, Shatter is able to freely criticize Prime Minister Eamon de Valera's government's shameful treatment of Jewish refugees during World War II, without fear of extreme political blowback. He is also able to more freely ruminate on his Jewish identity, without his allegiance to Ireland being questioned. Shatter's less fraught relationship with his heritage shows how dramatically Irish society has evolved since Briscoe's time. This picture of Briscoe meeting JFK took place during Briscoe's tour of the United States during his tenure as mayor, where he was met with acclaim due to his unique religious background. Briscoe said that his status as both a Jew and the mayor of Dublin illustrated the absolute tolerance of the Irish capital. He was upheld as an example of Irish progressive values, but was also used to mask an undercurrent of anti-Semitism in Ireland. While Ireland was a place of relative refuge, at least compared to the rest of Europe during this time, there are many historic incidents of anti-Semitism, such as the Limerick pogrom of 1904, which showed there was animosity towards Jews. On a personal note, Briscoe was denied a ministerial position during his tenure, despite his close personal friendship with the Prime Minister and his long service. This was because de Valera wanted to avoid provoking the anti-Semitic element of the electorate. Additionally, all three books tell of instances of being called a damn Jewman, a dirty Jew, or of having rocks thrown at them for allegedly crucifying Christ. Despite this, all three, particularly Briscoe, downplay all instances of anti-Semitism in Ireland. Briscoe himself actually released a statement saying, "I deny emphatically the people of Ireland are or have ever been anti-Semitic." This statement was not true and would have devastating consequences during World War II. During World War II, Ireland kept its borders mostly closed to Jewish refugees, admitting as few as 60 in total. This was in part to this man pictured, Charles Bewley. Bewley was sent to Berlin to represent Irish interests in the 1930s, at the same time Robert Briscoe was sent to Germany. However, Bewley was a raging anti-Semite and an overt supporter of Hitler. Briscoe avoids talking about Bewley too extensively in his book, except for one story where, after Briscoe hears about an anti-Semitic remark Bewley made, he and a friend destroyed Bewley's office. Briscoe's recounting of this tale characterizes Bewley as childishly fearful and completely submissive to Briscoe. However, this story omits the damaging realities of Bewley's tenure in Berlin. Bewley had real power, which Briscoe omits in his biography, which he used to send anti-Semitic propaganda to Ireland, as well as deny Irish visas to Jewish refugees. Briscoe's retelling shows the shortcomings of autobiography, as it only recounts the history the author wishes to be remembered. Alan Shatter, speaking decades later, is able to condemn Bewley, which he does after finding anti-Semitic materials by him in the state archives. But Briscoe, despite his close personal relationship, is unable to do so or to criticize Irish inaction during World War II more fully. The legacy of Jews in Ireland is complex. While all three men hold the belief that Ireland and their Jewish identity can coexist without significant conflict or contradiction, their methods for achieving this differ. Briscoe does so by hyper-emphasizing his Irish loyalties, while whitewashing instances of Irish anti-Semitism. Herzog completely embraces his Jewish identity while maintaining pride in his Irish roots. Alan Shatter is able to emphasize both aspects of his identity, showing that Ireland has changed in significant ways from his time to Briscoe's. The generational divide between Shatter and Briscoe illustrates the evolution of Ireland from the mid-20th century to the present day. While Briscoe downplays anti-Semitic action, Irish bigotry had serious consequences during World War II, particularly in regards to Jewish refugees. Yet, Jewish response to this history is not monolithic. The three biographies' different approach to Jewish history in Ireland demonstrates the richness of expression of Irish Jewish identity, as well as the complexity of Jewish relationships to Ireland in their search for acceptance and belonging. Thank you.
Sorry, while Michelle's sitting down, I failed to note that Michele is also a recipient of an award, the Linda Peterson Award in Political History for the History Department, so thank you. So our third presenter in this first panel is Avery Weinman, and Avery will be presenting a small portion of her larger thesis, which is entitled Reverberations from the Earthquake, Collective Memory, and Why Mizrahi Israelis Vote for the Israeli Right. And she worked with Alma Heckman and Bruce Thompson in developing that project. Oh, sorry. Two sheets of paper are really bedeviling me here. My second sheet of paper tells me that Avery is the recipient of the Linda Peterson Award in Intellectual History from the History Department and the Hitchcock Award for the Best Overall Essay. So now you can come on up.
So hi everyone, my name is Avery Weinman, and my project is titled Reverberations from the Earthquake, Collective Memory, and Why Mizrahi Israelis Vote for the Israeli Right. So, as some of you may know, just under a month ago, Israel held general elections in which this man and appropriately smug-looking Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party won. If the government coalition that Netanyahu forms holds together for the standard 4 years, he's poised to become the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history. This election relates directly to what I'm going to talk to you about today, considering Likud's decisive victory was due in no small part to really strong voter turnout from their Mizrahi base. This presentation will, at least in part, help to explain why these Jews tend to vote so strongly right-wing, and in turn why the right remains such a dominant force in Israeli politics. Before moving on, I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what I'm going to cover in this presentation. I'll begin with some information on collective memory, what it is and how it informed my thesis. I'll also provide you with some background information on Mizrahi Jews so we all have a basic level of understanding about the main population in question. After establishing this context, I'll lay out the main findings of my work, which, because of the time constraints of this presentation and the fact that I'm adapting down from 187 pages, I will explain through one case study. Finally, I'll wrap up by summarizing the conclusions of my thesis and by offering some future implications for this project. So, what is collective memory? I'll paraphrase this quote from Yael Zerubbabel, whose work heavily influenced how I thought about collective memory in my work. Collective memory is how any given group constructs and understands their own histories and identities. Since collective memory emphasizes perception and emotional reactions, independent of how these perceptions and reactions may be significantly less nuanced or complex than we would consider the hard historical reality, collective memory is a really interesting lens through which to look at politics and movements. Additionally, having collective memory as my theoretical framework for this thesis allowed me to pursue what I framed as an empathetic intervention in trying to answer this main question about why Mizrahi Israelis are so consistently right-wing. In approaching this question, I was much more interested in moving beyond the more obvious answers like the economy or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to strike at the heart of why people think the way they think and act the way they act. So while I want to preface that Mizrahi Jews as a category is so much more complex than I'm going to be covering in this presentation, generally speaking, Mizrahi Jews are Jews who trace their heritage to across the Middle East and North Africa in what we would identify as the Arab and Islamic worlds. As such, we're talking about Jews whose culture and identity is heavily influenced by Arab and Islamic culture. These are Jews who are far more likely to speak Arabic than Yiddish, to make shakshuka than matzo ball soup, and whose general cultural zeitgeist is a lot more 1001 Nights than it is Fiddler on the Roof. It is important to note that Mizrahi Jews constitute the Jewish demographic majority of Israel and have since the late 1950s. This is in a really stark contrast to here in America, where Mizrahim constitutes something like less than 10% of a total Jewish American population that is north of 90% Ashkenazi or European background. In a very short summary, the early Mizrahi experience in Israel in the mid-20th century was largely characterized by racism and Orientalism in their context with the labor Zionist state. As a quick aside for clarification, the labor Zionists were the largely Ashkenazi, secular, socialist Israelis who we would most recognize from institutions like the kibbutz. They were what we should consider the old guard or the establishment of Israeli politics. The early Mizrahi experience in Israel translated in what we could identify as a disproportionately disadvantaged socioeconomic position, or in significantly less wordy terms, something that looks like a second-class citizenship. The implications of these early experiences found a long-lasting reach for Israel's Mizrahim, who remain more likely to work blue-collar jobs and to live in low- to middle-class neighborhoods and cities. Having set up that context, these are the main findings of my thesis. These four categories, which I framed as a series of magnetic-like poles, make up the main content of Mizrahi Israelis' collective memory of their relationship to the Israeli right. They are as follows. 1, a shared sense of mistreatment by the Israeli left. 2, a warm recollection of the Jewish diaspora. 3, an emphasis and veneration of Jewish pride. And 4, a shared liberal understanding of Israeli identity as based on a flexible notion of Jewishness. These four types of memories are most frequently cited by Mizrahi Israelis as factors in why they choose to affiliate themselves with the Israeli right, as well as the memories most likely to be converted into socio-political action. So like I said at the top of this presentation, I'll be explaining how these findings work through one case study, demonstrating how memories influence current politics through this one example of the Mabarot. Mabarot were semi-temporary, semi-permanent housing settlements set up primarily in the 1950s to accommodate the massive influx of Jews to Israel following the state's establishment in 1948. Recall that in this time period, the state was absolutely dominated by the labor Zionists that I explained to you just a short while ago. Among this massive influx of Jews to Israel were the many tens of thousands of Mizrahi Jews who arrived in this period. Now, as you can see from these pictures, Mabarot were overcrowded, built from really cheap materials like tarp or tin, and very unsanitary with limited communal bathrooms shared by hundreds and sometimes even thousands of people. These conditions, combined with the fact that Mabarot were economically isolated, located in peripheral and dangerous parts of the country, and more likely to be home to Mizrahim, who often spent years there, than Ashkenazim, who were resettled by the state more quickly, led the Mabarot to become the pinnacle of Mizrahi Israelis' memory of mistreatment by the labor Zionists and the Israeli left. For many Mizrahim, the Mabarot embodied the racism, Orientalism, and general frustrations and humiliations of the early Mizrahi experience in Israel. Now, fast forward to 2018, to a piece from the Jerusalem desk of the New York Times, where journalist Isabel Kirshner surveyed several Mizrahim about why it is that they support Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party. When Kirshner asked Yehuda Ayash, who's pictured here on the far right in the nice powder blue shirt and glasses, why he votes for Likud, this is what he said. Mr. Ayash described how his mother would sit in their tin shack with 6 of her 11 children in her lap to keep them off the wet floor in winter. So Mr. Ayash didn't cite economics, he didn't cite the conflict, he didn't cite terror, he didn't cite any particular policy or politician, he cited memory. As a specific case, we can see how Mr. Ayash's memories of the Mabarot inform his decision to support the Israeli right, and as a representative example, we can see how memory informs current politics. So now I'll leave you with some closing remarks. They give my main conclusions as well as future implications. 1, memory consistently reoccurs as one of Mizrahi Israelis' primary motivations for voting Likud and affiliating themselves with the Israeli right. 2, identification with the Israeli right forms a major component of Mizrahi Israelis' self-conceptualization of their own identities and an understanding of their role in what I like to call the historical narrative of the State of Israel. And finally, what I hope you all take away as the main implication for this project, an increased focus on Mizrahi Israelis is a necessary corrective for a critical and consequential dearth in the American historiography. I want to re-stress that this is the Jewish demographic majority of Israel, capitalized, underlined majority, and as such, Mizrahim will play a defining role in the country's politics, society, and culture. Discourse in academia and the public square alike that erases these voices should be considered of limited, if frankly any usefulness at all. And I hope that you all take this information about Israeli politics with you the next time you have to think critically about Israel and the Middle East. Thank you very much for your time. Stays up here. All right. Thank you. Stay.
All right, thank you three so much. I think this gives you just a little bit of a taste of the kinds of research projects our undergraduates develop in exit seminars and in thesis projects. And I know it seems kind of cruel to give you these tantalizing tastes that invite all kinds of questions. So I hope you will share your questions and your congratulations with our panelists while we take a break. And I'll just note, just before we do, I do think these three papers together do really illustrate how it is that history can help us understand real problems in our current moment. All three are contending in some degree with questions of identity, whether it's defined as renters or property owners, or questions of religious identity, or the identity that comes through our histories. And so I think it illustrates what happens when we ask real questions and contend with problematic sources that sometimes don't give us exactly what we want, but we can sometimes twist and bend in order to get them to yield some really valuable insights. So I really appreciate all three papers for illustrating that, the potential of what historical research can do for us. So I'd love to invite you to, as I said, take a break, get a drink with us, come and speak with the presenters from the first panel, and then after the break, we'll be having a presentation by Juliet Carpenter, someone who was up here doing this a little while back, about her experiences as a history graduate, what she's done with her history training and her professional life since leaving UCSC. So if you join me in giving one more round of applause for our presenters in the first panel.